The vanishing trail, it all started as a simple weekend plan. Sarah and her three closest friends, Mike, Jenna, and Chris, had been looking forward to escaping the stress of their daily routines. Between demanding jobs and busy schedules, they barely had time to relax. So, when Mike suggested a weekend hike, everyone quickly agreed. The trail they chose, Whispering Pines, was a local favorite. It was known for its peaceful scenery, towering trees, and the gentle sounds of nature. The path was well marked and considered easy, even for beginners. The plan was to hike a few miles, enjoy the fresh air, and be back in time for dinner. What could go wrong? The four friends arrived early that Saturday morning, their backpacks filled with water bottles, snacks, and sandwiches for lunch. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light through the forest. Birds chirped happily, and the cool morning air felt refreshing against their skin. It was the perfect start to their adventure. They set off on the trail, chatting and laughing as they walked. Mike led the group, always the most energetic and adventurous. Sarah followed close behind, enjoying the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Jenna and Chris walked together at the back, snapping photos of the scenery and joking about how this hike was exactly what they needed. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The trail was wide and well maintained, with signs marking the way every so often. Occasionally, they passed other hikers who smiled and greeted them warmly. Everything felt safe and normal, just as they had expected. By noon, they reached the midpoint of the trail. It was a clearing with a small stream running through it. The sound of trickling water was soothing, and the group decided it was the perfect spot to stop for lunch. They sat on large rocks near the stream, unpacked their sandwiches, and took in the peaceful surroundings. The forest seemed alive but calm, with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. As they ate, Jenna's attention was drawn to something unusual. Half hidden by overgrown bushes, she noticed an old wooden sign. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered, and most of the writing was impossible to read. However, an arrow carved into the sign pointed toward a narrow, overgrown path leading deeper into the forest. "Hey, look at that," Jenna said, pointing toward the sign. The others turned to see what she was talking about. Mike's face lit up with curiosity. "That's interesting," he said. "It must be an old trail. Let's check it out. It could be fun to explore." Sarah frowned. "Are you sure? The main trail is nice and safe. That one looks abandoned." Jenna nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it doesn't even look like anyone's been down there in years." But Mike was insistent. "Come on. Well, just follow it for a little while and see where it goes. If it gets too rough, well, turn back." Chris, always the peacemaker, shrugged. "It might be cool to see something different. As long as we don't go too far, it should be fine." After a bit more hesitation, Sarah and Jenna reluctantly agreed. They packed up their lunch and followed Mike onto the narrow path. The trail was clearly old and unused. The ground was uneven, with roots and weeds making it difficult to walk. Branches hung low, and the path was barely visible in some spots. Still, there was something intriguing about it, as if it held a secret waiting to be discovered. As they walked, the atmosphere began to change. The cheerful sounds of the forest faded away. The birds stopped singing, and even the rustling of leaves seemed to quiet down. The trees grew taller and closer together, their twisted branches creating an almost tunnel-like effect. Sunlight barely filtered through, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. "This is getting creepy," Jenna said, her voice breaking the silence. "Maybe we should go back." Sarah nodded. "I agree. This doesn't feel right." But Mike was already ahead of them, determined to see where the trail led. "Just a little farther," he called over his shoulder. "I think I see something up ahead." Reluctantly, the group continued to follow him. After another 30 minutes of walking, they came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof was partially caved in, the windows were shattered, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and vines. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as it swayed in the breeze. "Whoa," Mike said, clearly fascinated. "This is amazing. We have to check it out." "No way," Jenna said, shaking her head. "That place looks like it's about to fall apart, and it's creepy. Come on," Mike urged. "It'll be fun. Don't you want to see what's inside?" Chris stepped in, trying to keep the peace. "How about this? We'll look around the outside, but we won't go in. Then we can head back." The others agreed to this compromise, and they began to circle the cabin. The ground around it was overgrown with weeds and scattered with broken wood and glass. As they walked, Sarah's foot caught on something. She looked down and saw a small leather-bound journal half buried in the dirt. "What's this?" she murmured, picking it up. The journal was old and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Most of the writing was smeared and unreadable, but one phrase stood out, written in bold letters. "Don't follow the whispers." Sarah showed the journal to the others. "Look at this. What do you think it means?" Before anyone could answer, a faint sound drifted through the trees. It was a soft, melodic whisper, like a gentle lullaby carried on the wind. The group froze. "Did you hear that?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Mike nodded, trying to act calm. "It's probably just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all directions, wrapping around them like an invisible net. Panic began to set in. "We need to go," Sarah said firmly. Now, the group quickly started back toward the main trail, but something was wrong. No matter which way they turned, they couldn't find their way back. The narrow path they had followed earlier seemed to have vanished. Instead, they kept ending up back at the clearing with the cabin. "This doesn't make sense," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We've been walking in circles." The whispers grew louder, turning into faint, chilling laughter. Shadows began to move between the trees, too fast and too dark to be human. The group huddled together, their fear growing with every passing moment. "What is happening?" Jenna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be real." One by one, the friends began to disappear. The shadows seemed to swallow them whole, pulling them into the darkness. Mike was the first to vanish, followed by Jenna and Chris. Sarah was the last one left, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder and more menacing. When she looked down at the journal, the pages were completely blank. The next morning, search teams found the group's campsite, but no trace of the hikers. Whispering Pines was closed to the public, and the mysterious abandoned trail was never seen again. The watcher in the woods, Tom, grew up in the countryside, surrounded by large forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. His house was small but cozy, with a big backyard that led straight into the woods. As a child, Tom loved spending his afternoons exploring the forest. He would build forts out of sticks, climb trees, and pretend he was a great adventurer discovering new lands. The woods felt like his own secret world, full of wonder and endless possibilities. But one summer, everything changed. Tom was 12 years old that year. It was a particularly hot summer, and the days seemed to last forever. He spent most of his time outdoors, wandering deeper into the woods than he ever had before. He felt safe there. The forest had always been a place of peace for him, a place where he could escape the noise of the world. But as the summer went on, something strange began to happen. It started with the noises. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, ordinary sounds of the forest. Tom thought it was just animals moving around. But as the days passed, the noises became more frequent and more unsettling. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he would lie in bed and hear the sounds drifting in through his open window. Branches snapping, low growls, and most disturbingly, footsteps. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, as if someone was walking just outside his house. But whenever Tom got up to look, there was nothing there. His parents told him not to worry. "It's probably just deer, or maybe a bear passing through," his dad said. This is the countryside, after all. But Tom wasn't convinced. The noises didn't feel like animals. They felt deliberate, almost like someone was trying to get his attention. One night, curiosity got the better of him. The strange noises had been getting louder, and Tom couldn't take it anymore. He decided to find out what was going on. Grabbing a flashlight and his dad's old hunting knife, he slipped out of the house and into the backyard. The air was cool and still, and the forest loomed ahead of him like a dark, endless wall. Taking a deep breath, Tom stepped into the woods. The forest was completely silent, except for the sound of his footsteps on the soft earth. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth. The scent of pine and damp soil filled the air. For a while, he didn't see anything unusual. It was just the same forest he had always known. But then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible beyond the reach of his flashlight. But as he moved closer, the shadow took shape. It was a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still. Its glowing eyes stared at him from the darkness, unblinking and cold. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. After what felt like an eternity, Tom finally found the strength to move. He turned and ran, not stopping until he was back in his room with the door locked and the knife still trembling in his hand. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the glowing eyes of the figure staring back at him. The next morning, Tom decided to look for clues. He went outside and checked the ground near his window. That's when he saw them, footprints. They were long and clawed, unlike anything he had ever seen before. They didn't look like they belonged to any animal he knew. Tom's stomach churned as he realized the prints led straight to his window and then disappeared into the woods. For weeks, the strange noises continued. Every night, Tom felt like he was being watched. Even during the day, he couldn't shake the feeling. The forest, once his favorite place, now felt like a place of danger. He stopped exploring it and avoided going outside after dark. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the sense of being watched never went away. Then, one night, something happened that Tom would never forget. He woke up in the middle of the night to a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with him. His heart raced as he slowly opened his eyes. At first, he didn't see anything. But then he noticed it, the figure, standing at the foot of his bed. Its glowing eyes were inches from his face, staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Tom screamed, and within seconds, his parents burst into the room. But by the time they turned on the light, the figure was gone. Tom tried to explain what he had seen, but his parents didn't believe him. They said it was just a bad dream, but Tom knew it was real. The very next day, Tom's parents made the decision to move. They packed up their belongings and left the house for good. Tom was relieved to leave the woods behind, but the memory of the figure stayed with him. Even years later, he couldn't forget those glowing eyes or the feeling of being watched. Though he never returned to the house, Tom often wondered about the figure. Was it still there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim? Or had it followed him, watching from the shadows wherever he went. He never found out. But one thing was certain. The Watcher in the woods would haunt him forever. The forgotten campground. Leela and Ethan were adventurers at heart. They had been dating for 3 years and shared a passion for camping. Over the years, they had visited countless parks and forests, pitching their tent under starry skies, hiking trails that took their breath away, and sharing stories by the warmth of a crackling fire. But nothing could have prepared them for the adventure they stumbled upon one cool autumn evening. They had planned a weekend trip to a well-known national park. The drive was peaceful, with golden leaves blanketing the winding roads. However, a wrong turn on an unfamiliar dirt path led them somewhere unexpected. The road narrowed, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. Just as they began to wonder if they should turn back, they saw it. An old, faded sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The letters were barely readable, but it said something like Cedar Hollow Campground. Ethan slowed the car, his curiosity piqued. "This isn't on the map," he said, leaning forward as if that would help him see the sign better. "Maybe there's a reason for that," Leela said, half joking. But Ethan's adventurous spirit got the better of him. "Let's check it out. It'll be fun." Reluctantly, Leela agreed. The path led them to what appeared to be a forgotten campground. The place was eerily quiet. Rusted fire pits sat unused, and faded wooden signs pointing to trails leaned at odd angles. The air felt still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot as they stepped out of the car. "This is perfect," Ethan said, smiling. "No crowds, no noise, just us and nature." They picked a spot near a small lake, its surface reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. As they set up their tent, Leela couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was different from the peaceful quiet she was used to in the wilderness. It felt heavy, almost unnatural. By the time night fell, they had built a fire and were roasting marshmallows. The warmth of the flames and the sweet, sticky treats eased some of Lila's unease. They laughed, told stories, and enjoyed the kind of solitude that was hard to find in their busy lives. But as the hours passed, the silence around them grew louder. The occasional rustle of leaves seemed to amplify, making both of them glance over their shoulders more often than usual. Around midnight, just as they were considering going to bed, they heard it, a soft humming. It was faint at first, like the melody of a lullaby carried on the wind. Leela froze, her marshmallow slipping off the stick and into the fire. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan tilted his head, listening. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind through the trees." But Leela wasn't convinced. The humming didn't sound random, like the wind. It was rhythmic, almost human. As they sat in silence, the sound grew louder. It seemed to come from all directions, surrounding them. Then, shadows began to flicker at the edges of the firelight. They were faint at first, but as the humming continued, the shadows seemed to grow bolder, creeping closer. Leela grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to leave," she said urgently. Ethan hesitated, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it's just animals, or someone else camping nearby. "Ethan, this place isn't even on the map. Who else would be here?" Before they could decide what to do, the fire suddenly went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The air grew cold, and the humming transformed into whispers. Words they couldn't understand filled the night, growing louder and more frantic. Then came the screams, high-pitched, chilling screams that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. Panic set in. They grabbed what they could and ran, leaving their tent and supplies behind. The forest seemed endless as they stumbled through the darkness, the shadows following them. Branches scratched their faces and arms, and every step felt like it brought them no closer to safety. Just when Leela thought they would never escape, they saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. They burst out of the forest and onto the main road, gasping for breath. A passing car stopped, and the driver, an older man, looked at them with concern. "What happened to you two?" he asked. Through tears, Leela and Ethan explained what they had experienced. The man's face grew pale. "Cedar Hollow. That place hasn't been used in decades. People say it's haunted. When they reported the campground to the authorities, they were told it didn't exist. There was no record of Cedar Hollow anywhere." No one believed them, but Leela and Ethan knew what they had seen. They never went camping again. The Silent Forest Emma was a wildlife photographer who loved to capture the beauty of untouched places. Her work took her to remote locations around the world, and her photos often appeared in magazines and galleries. When she heard about a place called the Silent Forest, she couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The locals in the nearby town warned her not to go. They told her the forest was cursed, that strange things happened to anyone who ventured too far in. Emma, however, dismissed their warnings as superstition. She had heard similar stories before and had never encountered anything she couldn't explain. The forest was like something out of a fairy tale, but not the happy kind. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they had been frozen mid-writhing. The ground was covered in moss so thick it muffled her footsteps. And then there was the silence. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. It was as if the forest held its breath, waiting. Emma felt a chill despite the warm sunlight filtering through the canopy. She tried to shake it off and focused on her work. Her camera clicked as she captured the unique beauty of the place. But as she ventured deeper, she noticed something odd. The trees were carved with strange symbols, patterns, and shapes she didn't recognize. She took photos of them, thinking she could research their meaning later. Hours passed, and the light began to fade. Emma decided it was time to head back. She pulled out her compass, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. Her GPS was no help either. It showed her location as unknown. "Great," she muttered, trying to stay calm. She had been lost before and always managed to find her way out. But as she turned to retrace her steps, she saw them. Figures in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Their faces were obscured by shadows, and they didn't move or make a sound. Emma's heart raced. She called out, "Hello, do you need help?" But her voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the forest. The figures didn't respond. They just stood there, watching. She tried to walk away, but no matter which direction she went, the figures were always there. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, leading her in circles. Exhausted and scared, she finally collapsed at the base of a tree. The last thing she remembered before blacking out was the feeling of being surrounded. When she woke up, she was at the edge of the forest. Her camera was gone, and her backpack had been rummaged through. She stumbled into town, shaken and confused. The locals looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. She tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. The photos Emma had taken were never found, and she never spoke of the Silent Forest again. Her career continued, but she refused to venture into remote places. The memory of that forest stayed with her, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unexplored. The Silent Forest Emma was a passionate wildlife photographer who loved to explore the unexplored. She spent her days traveling to remote locations, hoping to capture the beauty of nature in its rawest form. Her photos were stunning, often showcasing rare animals and landscapes that most people could only dream of seeing. One day, she heard about a mysterious place called the Silent Forest. It was said to be an untouched, ancient forest where time itself seemed to stand still. The stories intrigued Emma, and she decided it was the perfect place for her next adventure. The locals in the nearby village warned her against going. They told her tales of strange happenings in the forest, of people entering and never returning. Some said the forest was cursed, while others believed it was protected by ancient spirits who didn't want to be disturbed. But Emma wasn't one to believe in superstitions. She thanked them for their advice, but brushed off their warnings as old village myths meant to scare outsiders. With her camera gear packed, Emma set out early one morning. The path leading to the silent forest was overgrown and barely visible, but she followed it with determination. The deeper she went, the more isolated she felt. The village disappeared behind her, and the world became quieter with every step. When she finally reached the edge of the forest, Emma was struck by its appearance. The trees were enormous, their trunks twisted and covered in moss. Their branches reached high into the sky, forming a canopy so dense that only small patches of sunlight managed to filter through. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and eerily silent. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Emma stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves on the ground. She began taking photos right away, marveling at the ancient beauty of the place. The twisted trees, the strange patterns of light, and the vibrant green moss made every shot look otherworldly. She felt a mix of excitement and unease, but pushed the latter aside. This was what she lived for, capturing the untamed beauty of the world. As she ventured deeper, Emma noticed something unusual. The trees had carvings on them, symbols she didn't recognize. Some looked like ancient runes, while others were intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. She photographed them, thinking she could research their meaning later. The further she went, the more carvings she found, and they grew more elaborate. It was as if someone, or something, had left them there as messages. Hours passed, and Emma became so engrossed in her work that she lost track of time. It wasn't until the light began to dim that she realized how late it was. She looked at her watch, but it had stopped working. Her phone had no signal, and when she checked her compass, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on a direction. A wave of unease washed over her as she realized she was lost. Trying to stay calm, Emma decided to retrace her steps. But no matter which way she went, the forest looked the same. The trees with their carvings seemed to repeat endlessly, and the lack of landmarks made it impossible to tell if she was making any progress. The silence, once intriguing, now felt suffocating. Her own breathing and footsteps were the only sounds, and even they seemed muted, swallowed by the dense air. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them. Figures in the distance, barely visible through the thick trees. They were tall and unmoving, their faces hidden in shadows. At first, Emma thought they might be other people, perhaps locals who had come to the forest. She called out to them, but her voice felt strangely weak, as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound. The figures didn't respond. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. A chill ran down Emma's spine. She tried to convince herself that her eyes were playing tricks on her, that it was just the fading light and her growing anxiety. But as she continued walking, the figures appeared again. No matter which direction she turned, they were always there, always watching. They never came closer, yet they never disappeared. Panic began to set in. Emma's breaths came faster, and her hands shook as she clutched her camera. She tried to focus on finding her way out, but her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The carvings on the trees seemed to glow faintly now, their patterns shifting as if they were alive. The forest no longer felt ancient and beautiful, it felt alive and menacing. Desperate, Emma started running. She didn't know where she was going, she just wanted to escape. Branches clawed at her arms and legs. and the uneven ground made her stumble more than once. The figures remained in the distance, always just visible enough to keep her on edge. She felt like a mouse being toyed with by a predator. Exhausted and terrified, Emma finally collapsed at the base of a massive tree. She couldn't run anymore. Her heart pounded in her chest, and tears streamed down her face. She clutched her camera tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Closing her eyes, she whispered a silent plea for help, though she wasn't sure who or what she was asking. When she opened her eyes, the forest was gone. She was lying on the ground at the edge of the trees, the same place where she had entered. The sun was rising, casting a warm light over the landscape. For a moment, Emma thought she had dreamed the entire experience. But when she reached for her camera, it was gone. Her bag was still with her, but the camera and the memory cards were missing. Emma returned to the village, shaken and confused. She didn't tell anyone what had happened, afraid they would think she was crazy. When she developed the remaining rolls of film from her bag, the photos of the silent forest were missing. It was as if the forest had erased itself from her memory and her equipment. After that day, Emma never spoke of the silent forest again. She continued her work as a photographer, but avoided any mention of that strange, silent place. The experience stayed with her, a haunting reminder that some places are better left untouched. The whispering tree in a small, quiet town surrounded by dense woods. There was a legend about a tree. This wasn't just any tree. It was said to have magical powers. People called it the Whispering Tree because it could grant wishes, but there was a catch. Every wish came with a price, and that price was often far worse than what anyone expected. For years, the story of the tree was passed down, scaring some people and intriguing others. One summer, a group of teenagers decided to find the tree and see if the legend was true. The group included Jessica, Ryan, Megan, and a few others from their high school. They had heard the stories about the whispering tree from older residents in town. Some people swore the tree was real, while others said it was just a spooky tale to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But these teenagers were curious, and they wanted an adventure. After weeks of planning, they picked a sunny Saturday to go searching for the tree. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and their phones, they set out early in the morning. The woods were thick and full of shadows, even during the day. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was easy to see why people found the forest creepy. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, made them jump. After hours of hiking, they came across a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree. Its trunk was wider than any tree they'd ever seen, and its roots twisted and coiled around the ground like giant snakes. The bark was dark and scarred, covered in names, dates, and symbols carved into it over the years. The tree's branches were so high that they seemed to disappear into the sky. A strange feeling washed over the group. They knew they had found the whispering tree. Jessica, the most daring of the group, was the first to approach it. "This has to be it," she said, running her hand along the rough bark. "Look at all these carvings. People have been coming here for years." Ryan, who was always skeptical, frowned. "It's just a tree. There's nothing magical about it." "Then why is there a legend?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt uneasy standing so close to the tree. There was something about it that didn't feel right. The group decided to test the legend. Each of them would make a wish and carve it into the tree. Jessica went first. She wished to be the most beautiful girl in town. "Imagine how popular it'll be," she said, smiling as she carved her wish into the bark with a pocket knife. Ryan rolled his eyes but joined in. He wished for wealth. "I'm tired of being broke," he said, carving his wish next to Jessica's. Megan hesitated, but she didn't want to be the only one who didn't make a wish. She wished for love. "I just want someone who cares about me," she said softly as she carved her words into the tree. The others made their wishes too, laughing and joking about what they'd do when their wishes came true. But as they stood around the tree, a strange wind blew through the clearing. The branches rustled, and it almost sounded like the tree was whispering. The laughter stopped, and an uneasy silence fell over the group. "Did you hear that?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. Feeling spooked, they decided to head back home. As they walked away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The woods seemed darker and more menacing than before. At first, nothing happened. The group began to think the legend was just a myth after all. But over the next few days, strange things started to occur. Jessica was the first to notice a change. She had always been pretty, but now people couldn't stop staring at her. Everywhere she went, heads turned. She loved the attention at first, but soon it became overwhelming. People followed her, desperate to get close to her. When she looked in the mirror, her reflection began to change. Her features became exaggerated, almost monstrous. Her once beautiful face was now something out of a nightmare. Ryan's wish for wealth came true in a way he never expected. One night, his family's house caught fire. Everyone made it out safely, but the house was completely destroyed. The insurance payout was huge, making Ryan's family rich overnight. But the guilt of losing his home and the suspicion that he somehow caused the fire haunted him. Megan's wish for love turned into a nightmare. A boy she barely knew at school became obsessed with her. At first, she thought it was sweet, but his behavior quickly became alarming. He followed her everywhere, sent her hundreds of messages, and grew angry whenever she talked to anyone else. She felt trapped and scared, unsure of how to escape his grip. The group realized the legend was true, and they were paying the price for their wishes. Panicked, they decided to return to the Whispering Tree to undo their wishes. They hiked back to the clearing, their hearts heavy with fear. When they reached the tree, it seemed even darker and more menacing than before. The carvings on its trunk seemed to pulse, and the air around it felt heavy. They begged the tree to take back their wishes. Jessica cried, pleading to be normal again. Ryan shouted, demanding the tree fix what it had done. Megan sobbed, asking for freedom from the obsessive boy. But the tree didn't respond. Instead, its branches swayed, and the whispers grew louder. The sound was chilling, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. One by one, the teenagers began to disappear. Jessica was the first. She stepped closer to the tree, begging for mercy, and in an instant, she was gone. Her name faded from the bark, as if it had never been there. Ryan tried to run, but the roots of the tree rose up and pulled him under. Megan screamed as the tree's branches wrapped around her, pulling her into its dark embrace. By the end of the night, the clearing was silent again. The Whispering Tree stood alone, its bark smooth and unmarked. The teenagers' names were gone, and there was no sign they had ever been there. The legend of the Whispering Tree lived on, though no one knew exactly what had happened to the group. Some people claimed to hear whispers coming from the woods at night, calling out to them, tempting them to make a wish. But those who knew the story warned others to stay away. The Whispering Tree was still there, waiting for its next victims, ready to grant wishes and take lives.